A millionaire CEO opened his car door, only to hear a 7-year-old black girl whisper, "Shut up, they're watching you." He had no idea that this child would uncover the betrayal that could steal his empire and change his life forever. Jonathan Miller never forgot the way silence used to comfort him. In the echo of an empty parking garage, silence meant control, meant order, meant everything was under his command. But tonight, silence turned into something else, a trap waiting to snap. The fluorescent neon lights flickered above as he approached his black BMW, polished to a mirror sheen. The reflection of the concrete pillars bent across the hood, and for a moment he thought the night belonged to him alone. His hand reached for the door handle, the key pressed between his fingers, and then it happened. A voice, small yet sharp as broken glass, cut straight through the air. "Shut up." He froze. The words had not come from behind him or above, but from inside the car itself. For a split second, his chest tightened. He wasn't a man who startled easily. Decades of running a $200 million empire had hardened him against surprises. But this was different. "Shut up and don't make a sound." The command carried a strange authority, though the tone was unmistakably a child's. Jonathan's gaze darted through the tinted windows, adjusting to the darkness inside. Then his eyes caught movement. There, curled on the back seat, was a little girl no older than 7. Her skin was dark, her clothes rumpled and dirty, her eyes far too alert for a child her age. They widened, flashing with fear as she lifted a trembling finger and pointed upward toward the glass-paneled corporate tower that loomed above them. Jonathan's own office lights were still on at the 10th floor, glowing like watchful eyes. He glanced instinctively toward them, confusion burning in his chest. The girl whispered urgently, every word deliberate. "They're watching. Your partner and his blonde wife. They said you'd be here right now." His stomach tightened into ice. Marcus and Diana, 2 names that had never once crossed his mind in suspicion during 15 years of building Miller Industries. Yet here they were, suddenly dripping with menace from the mouth of a street child hiding in his car. He opened the driver's door slowly, carefully, his movements deliberate, as though afraid of breaking the fragile thread, holding this surreal moment together. He slid inside without starting the engine, his heart pounding a little faster than usual, the smell of leather and faint perfume mixing with the stale air. His voice came low, firm, edged with the disbelief of a man whose world had tilted without warning. "Who are you?" The girl pressed herself into the corner of the seat, clutching her knees, still whispering, "My name is Jasmine, and you are Jonathan Miller. I heard them say it 1,000 times upstairs." He turned, stunned that she knew his name, that she even knew who he was. "How do you know me?" She leaned forward just enough for the light from the overhead lamp to brush across her small face. "Because I listen, and they talk too much when they think no one is paying attention." He wanted to dismiss her words, laugh off the idea that his most trusted ally and the assistant who had managed his life for over a decade were plotting in secret. But there was something in her tone, steady, frightened, unshakably sincere, that stopped him cold. "What are you doing in my car?" His voice dropped into a whisper to match hers. She answered without hesitation. "I saw the cleaning lady leave it open, so I hid. I needed to, because if I didn't, you would have walked right into their trap tomorrow." He inhaled slowly, his mind catching on her words. Tomorrow. He knew exactly what she meant. The meeting. The $400 million merger Marcus and Diana had worked months to prepare. Jasmine's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts again. "They said tomorrow you'll sign the papers and it will all be over. That you'll be left with nothing." Jonathan's hand clenched around the steering wheel, though the car had not yet moved. The words tasted bitter. 15 years of loyalty, of friendship, and in one instant he could see it all dissolving. And then Jasmine added the sentence that struck deeper than all the rest. The blonde woman laughed and said, "You're like an obedient little dog, that you'll wag your tail and sign without even reading." For a long moment, Jonathan said nothing. Neon light pulsed through the windshield, washing his face in stark shadow. His pride stung, his chest burned with humiliation, but beneath it all something else stirred. A dangerous clarity. The girl shrank further into the corner, whispering again, "I wasn't supposed to tell you. But my grandma always said, if you see someone being stepped on, you help. Because next time, it might be you." Jonathan stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, and in that reflection, he saw the beginning of something he could neither fully understand nor ignore. A 7-year-old child who had no reason to care about him had just cracked open a truth that could destroy everything he had built. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Miller felt the unmistakable pulse of fear mixed with something else he had nearly forgotten: resolve. Jonathan's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, though the engine was silent. the weight of the moment pressing down like the concrete ceiling above them. The neon glow bled across the windshield, catching his reflection in fragments of glass and steel. Up on the 10th floor, the lights still burned bright, and in that glow, two silhouettes moved like predators circling their prey. Jasmine leaned closer, her small body trembling, her voice dropping to a whisper sharp enough to cut the. "They were talking about you," she said, "about how tomorrow you'll walk into that room smiling and you'll walk out with nothing." Jonathan turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing at the illuminated windows. He could almost see them, Marcus's broad frame pacing with that familiar arrogance, Diana's golden hair glinting as she leaned close, her gestures animated, too confident, too rehearsed. His stomach clenched. He had trusted them with everything. For a moment he thought Jasmine might be exaggerating, spinning stories as frightened children sometimes did. But then she added, "They said you'll sign without reading, that you'll hand over everything yourself." Jonathan's jaw tightened. 15 years with Marcus, 10 with Diana, and this was how they spoke of him when the walls were supposed to protect secrets. As if on cue, the figures on the 10th floor paused. One of them, tall and deliberate, stepped toward the glass. Jasmine gasped and yanked at Jonathan's sleeve. "Down now." Instinct took over. He ducked low in the driver's seat, Jasmine folding herself against the floor of the back seat. The silence of the garage grew heavier. From their crouched positions, they could feel the gaze pressing down through glass and neon. For a second, Jonathan thought the eyes above had pierced the shadows and locked onto his car. His pulse thundered louder than any engine he had ever driven. He dared not move, not a twitch. Jasmine's breath came fast and shallow, but her voice held steady as a wire pulled tight. They were laughing. She pressed her lips close to his ear, a ghost of sound. "The woman said tomorrow you'll be finished. That tonight is your last night as the owner of anything." He turned his eyes just enough to catch her face in the rearview mirror. Her expression was deadly serious, older than her years. She wasn't spinning fairy tales. She was repeating sentences that had been dropped like daggers into her small ears. Jonathan forced himself to glance back at the glass tower. The silhouette lingered another moment, then turned away. The tension eased only slightly. "They almost saw us," Jasmine whispered, curling tighter into herself. "They said you would be here now, that this was the time they'd catch you off guard." Jonathan's mind raced, assembling fragments into a picture that grew darker with each passing second. Tomorrow wasn't just another meeting. It was the culmination of a plan carefully laid over years. Jasmine's words pressed harder. "They planned this for a long time. They said the papers are ready, the investors already convinced, and that after tomorrow you'll be gone." He felt his throat dry. Gone. A single word that carried the weight of everything he had built, the empire he had carved from nothing but persistence and vision. And yet two people, two he had trusted as family, were preparing to erase him with a few strokes of a pen. The garage seemed colder now, the hum of the lights above turning into a sinister rhythm. Jonathan spoke at last, his voice low, almost to himself. "Why are you telling me this?" Jasmine's reply came without hesitation. "Because no one else will. Because they think you're blind, and I know what it feels like when people look at you like you're nothing." Her small hands clenched into fists, as if holding onto invisible threads of courage. "My grandma always said the worst betrayal is when the ones closest to you sharpen the knife." Jonathan's chest tightened. A child was echoing truths he had ignored for years, and suddenly the warning lights in his mind began flashing with brutal clarity. This wasn't paranoia. This was premeditated, organized. Jasmine's gaze flicked upward again. "They're still there, watching, waiting." He swallowed hard and forced his body upright, but inside, everything was already shifting. Tomorrow was no longer about business. It was survival. And for the first time, Jonathan Miller began to understand that the little girl in his back seat might be the only ally he had left. The diner sat at the corner of an almost deserted street, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the silence of the night. Jonathan pushed the glass door open, the chime above tinkling with a tired sound. Inside, the air smelled of fried food and coffee that had been left on the burner too long. He guided Jasmine to a booth near the back where the light was dimmer, where the world seemed to forget about them for a while. The waitress, half asleep, barely looked up as she set down 2 menus. But Jasmine didn't need one. Her eyes had locked on the plate of hamburgers someone else had just been served. Jonathan nodded and ordered without hesitation, letting her eat first, talk later. When the food arrived, Jasmine attacked it like a soldier who hadn't seen a meal in days. Between bites, her eyes flicked up at him with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. He studied her in silence, the way her small hands clutched at the fries, the way her shoulders stayed tense as if expecting someone to snatch the plate away. She was a child, but her face carried shadows most adults never knew. At last she spoke, her voice muffled around a bite of bread. I don't have a place. Sometimes the shelter, sometimes not. Depends if there's room. Depends if the boys aren't being too mean. She said it as casually as if she were describing the weather, but the matter-of-fact tone hit Jonathan harder than any betrayal upstairs. You're on the streets, he murmured, not a question, more a painful realization. Jasmine shrugged, wiping ketchup from her chin with the back of her hand. Been like that a while. Grandma used to take care of me, but she got sick. She always told me if you see someone getting stepped on and you can help, you help. Because next time it could be you. Jonathan leaned back, the sentence circling inside his head, refusing to leave. A 7-year-old child, surviving on scraps of wisdom and courage, had just put into words what he had forgotten in boardrooms full of polished lies. His chest tightened. And you thought I was the one being stepped on. Jasmine's chewing slowed. She lifted her eyes to his, unflinching, and asked the question that pierced deeper than any accusation. Do you think you're worth saving? The diner's hum seemed to fall silent. Jonathan blinked, startled by the directness. He had been asked about market shares, investments, mergers worth millions, but never this, never stripped down to his bare humanity. For a long moment, he didn't answer. His mind went back through the years of compromises, of late nights chasing numbers, of handshakes with men who smiled while calculating their advantage. Was he worth saving, or had he let greed and trust blind him until he was little more than a lamb fattened for slaughter? Jasmine dipped a fry in ketchup, waiting patiently for a reply he could not yet give. Finally, he exhaled, the corners of his lips twitching with something like irony. I built something from nothing, he said quietly. Maybe that's worth something. She tilted her head, studying him with an unsettling clarity. Building doesn't always mean keeping. Grandma used to say it's not what you build, it's what you protect that shows who you really are. Her words landed heavy, and Jonathan felt the weight settle in his bones. Protect. He had protected Marcus's reputation, Diana's career, the image of a flawless company. But himself, his legacy, his own dignity, those he had left undefended. He rubbed his temples, the reality cutting in sharper than the bitter coffee cooling beside him. Across the booth, Jasmine licked her fingers and added softly, I don't think you're stupid like they say. I think you just forgot people can be cruel, and forgetting can be dangerous. He stared at her, realizing this child had seen more cruelty in 7 years than he had in 52. She had nothing, no money, no home, no protection, and yet she carried herself with a code stronger than most executives he knew. And in that moment, Jonathan Miller, Millionaire CEO, found himself the one being taught. The twist was not in the betrayal waiting tomorrow, but in the reflection staring back at him now. A girl with nothing had just forced him to ask the question he had avoided his whole life. Was he truly worth saving? The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the city outside, the kind of silence that should have brought rest, but instead carried the weight of dread. Jonathan sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop screen casting pale light across his face. His phone vibrated again, the 10th time in less than an hour. Another message from Marcus, dripping with the same false warmth that had always passed as friendship. Rest well, partner. Tomorrow will be historic. You won't regret trusting us. He stared at the words until they blurred, the hollow cheerfulness twisting into something colder the longer he looked. The next vibration came almost immediately after. Diana this time. Good evening, boss. I've prepared all the documents. Everything is clean just like you like it. I highlighted where you'll need to sign. Sleep easy, you're in good hands. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Good hands. The phrase stung like a slap. For 10 years he had relied on Diana's efficiency, her devotion, her memory sharper than his own. She had arranged his calendar, paid his bills, even reminded him to send flowers on anniversaries. She knew every detail of his life, every password, every account, every weakness. And now those hands that once held his trust were guiding the knife toward his back. The screen pinged again. An email this time, a set of attachments from Diana, contracts, agreements. A final confirmation of tomorrow's deal. He hovered over the first file, exhaustion tugging at him. Habit whispered that he could trust her, that she had never once failed him. He clicked, the document opening with its neat formatting and highlighted boxes. All he had to do was apply his digital signature, one click to close the night and let tomorrow come. His finger moved toward the pad, almost without thinking. Then a small shadow stirred in the doorway. Jasmine, wrapped in a blanket too big for her, rubbed her eyes and stepped closer. What are you doing? She asked softly, her voice carrying a weight beyond her years. Jonathan blinked, startled, caught like a child sneaking something he shouldn't, just reviewing some contracts. She frowned, stepping up to the desk, her gaze sharper than any auditor's. "Show me." He hesitated, then turned the laptop slightly. Jasmine squinted at the dense text, her finger running along the lines. "Here," she said suddenly, tapping at a paragraph buried among the legal jargon. "This doesn't make sense. It says you agree to transfer ownership before the merger is even completed. Why would you do that?" Jonathan leaned closer, and the blood drained from his face. She was right. A single clause, camouflaged among harmless details, but lethal. Signing it tonight would strip him of authority before the meeting even began. By tomorrow, he would already be finished. His hand trembled slightly as he closed the file. For years, he had trusted Diana so completely he no longer read the fine print she placed in front of him. Tonight, that blind faith nearly cost him everything. Jasmine looked at him, her small face stern. "They're counting on you to be tired, to not pay attention. That's how people like them win." He leaned back in his chair, pressing his palms over his eyes, anger burning hot beneath his ribs. Not at Jasmine, not even fully at Marcus and Diana, but at himself. The man who had let loyalty turn into blindness. His phone buzzed again, another message lighting up the screen, from Diana. "Don't worry about the details, boss. You know you can always trust me." He let the words sink in, and this time, instead of comfort, they brought only a chill that reached his bones. Because now he understood. This wasn't just business betrayal. Diana held his passwords, his bank accounts, his family contacts, the locations of safe deposit boxes. She had logged into his email countless times at his request. She knew more about him than anyone alive. The realization struck like ice water. If she wanted to, she could dismantle not just his company, but his entire life. She didn't just betray his trust at work. She owned the keys to his private world. Jonathan lowered his hands and looked at Jasmine. The girl's eyes reflected both fear and determination, as if she too understood the enormity of what had just been revealed. He whispered, half to himself, half to the night, "I've been living in their cage all along. The cage they built with my own trust." Jasmine leaned closer, her voice a fragile thread. "Then it's time to break out before they lock the door forever." He nodded slowly, the weight of betrayal now absolute, and with it, a new fire stirring in his chest. Tonight had almost been the end. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would not walk into their trap as prey. Tomorrow he would decide whether Jonathan Miller still belonged to them or to himself. The morning light poured into the kitchen, pale and sharp, as if the city itself was reminding Jonathan that the night had changed everything. The coffee machine hissed in the background, filling the room with a bitter smell. Jasmine sat at the table, swinging her legs, still wrapped in the oversized blanket from the night before. Jonathan stood at the counter, tie loosened, eyes heavy but clear. The knock on the door came at exactly 8 o'clock. Jonathan opened it to find Gabriel Torres, the former investigator he had not seen since Marcus and Diana orchestrated his dismissal a year ago. Gabriel looked older, his dark eyes carrying the weight of too many secrets. Scars on his hands caught the light as he extended a firm handshake. "Jonathan," he said simply, voice low, steady, almost relieved. Inside the kitchen, Gabriel's presence filled the space like a silent warning and a promise all at once. He set his leather bag on the table and pulled out a stack of papers, spreadsheets, and a tablet. Jasmine studied him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, her small face peeking over her plate of toast. Jonathan poured 2 coffees, then sat opposite Gabriel, his heart pounding with anticipation. Gabriel wasted no time. "Marcus and Diana have been siphoning money for years." He tapped the tablet, where lines of transfers and numbers appeared, crisp and undeniable. "Shell companies, fake clients, offshore accounts. Together they've taken over $5 million in 2 years. Jonathan stared at the screen, anger tightening his chest. "So it's true." Gabriel nodded. "It's true, but here's the problem. This is enough to make noise, but not enough to bury them. They've covered their tracks too well. If you go to the police now, they'll stall, hide evidence, and by the time anything moves forward, you'll already be out." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "We need more, something undeniable." Jasmine leaned forward, eyes wide with the thrill of being part of something bigger than herself. "I can do it," she said, her voice steady. "I can sneak back in, listen again, get proof." Jonathan's heart lurched at the suggestion. "Absolutely not. You've risked enough." But Jasmine shook her head, determination flashing in her gaze. "They don't see me. That's why I can do it. People don't pay attention to kids like me." She glanced at Gabriel, as if daring him to contradict her. Gabriel gave a half smile, impressed despite himself. "She's not wrong. Sometimes the smallest shadows reveal the biggest truths." Jonathan rubbed his temples. The thought of sending a child back into the jaws of danger twisted his stomach, yet he couldn't deny the accuracy of her words. Marcus and Diana's arrogance was their weakness. They never imagined a little girl could be their undoing. Gabriel leaned forward, lowering his voice. Jonathan, they're planning to use you to validate everything. Once your signature is on those papers, the merger goes through. The money gets cleaned and you're gone. If we want to stop them, we need them exposed in real time. Catch them speaking, plotting, admitting everything. Jasmine's small hand tapped the table to pull his attention back. Isn't that what Grandma said? If you see someone being stepped on, you help. Maybe this is how I can help. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the fridge. Jonathan stared at her, torn between the instinct to protect and the reality of what they faced. He looked at Gabriel, searching for another way. Gabriel only shook his head. The girl has a point. They've built their trap carefully, but arrogance makes people careless. If she hears one more conversation, it might be enough. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight pressing heavier. His life had been built on strategies, on reading markets, on calculating risks. Yet now, the survival of everything he had created seemed to balance on the courage of a 7-year-old child. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the city bathed in morning light. The skyline shimmered with power and opportunity, yet none of it felt secure anymore. For the first time, Jonathan realized this wasn't just about defending his company. It was about winning in the one arena Marcus and Diana thought they owned, the art of deception, manipulation, control. He whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, I can't just survive this. I have to beat them at their own game. Behind him, Jasmine straightened in her chair, her face lit with a mix of pride and fire. Then let's play, she said. Jonathan turned back to see Gabriel watching him closely, waiting for the decision that would define everything. Hope sparked faintly in Jonathan's chest, not pure, not safe, but fierce. The battle had shifted, and for the first time since the betrayal began, he was no longer just defending. He was preparing to strike. The conference room gleamed under cold fluorescent lights, its long polished table set like a battlefield prepared for war. Stacks of documents were arranged with surgical precision, yellow markers sticking out like little flags of surrender waiting for Jonathan's signature. Marcus stood at the head of the table, broad smile fixed to his face, the perfect mask of confidence. Diana hovered near him, her blonde hair immaculate, her expression one of gentle authority, like a mother guiding a child who didn't know better. Jonathan entered quietly, shoulders straight, expression calm, his steps betraying none of the storm inside him. Marcus clapped him on the back as if nothing had ever changed. Jonathan, my friend, I'm glad you're here. Everything is ready. Today is the day we make history. Diana slid a leather folder across the table toward him, her voice smooth, practiced. Just sign where I marked. Trust me, as you always have. Jonathan sat, placing his hands lightly on the folder, eyes flicking over the highlighted lines without giving away what he already knew. He forced a small smile, nodding as though grateful. The room pulsed with their arrogance, their certainty that the game was already over. Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice as if confiding in a brother. Before we begin, though, there's something you should see. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, and cast an email onto the projector. The screen lit up with words that turned the room colder. It was a forged correspondence, carefully crafted, showing Jonathan authorizing unauthorized transfers of company funds into offshore accounts. Marcus's voice carried the weight of false sympathy. I didn't want to believe it, Jonathan, but when the auditors found this, Diana insisted we give you a chance to explain yourself. Diana tilted her head, her eyes shimmering with feigned concern. We've always trusted you. But if the Japanese investors saw this, she let the implication hang, her smile faint, her trap snapping shut. Jonathan stared at the screen, letting the silence stretch, letting them believe he was cornered. Marcus pressed, his tone sharpening. It's over, Jonathan. Either you sign these documents and step aside quietly, or we take this to the board and let everyone see what you've done. For a moment, the weight in the room shifted, pressing down on Jonathan like a stone. Anyone else might have broken, but he only leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, voice calm. Interesting. He glanced toward the door. That's quite a story. Shame it's about to fall apart. The door opened, and Gabriel Torres stepped in carrying a box of files. 2 federal investigators followed, their badges glinting under the sterile light. Marcus's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, forcing out a laugh. Gabriel, I thought you were long gone. Gabriel's tone was dry, steady, cutting. I was. But now I work for the man you tried to destroy. He set the box on the table with a heavy thud. Jonathan rose and connected his laptop to the projector, his voice steady as steel. Marcus, Diana, do you remember this conversation? The screen shifted. Not the forged email, but spreadsheets, bank transfers, signatures, 5 million siphoned through 17 shell companies. Diana's face went pale, her fingers tightening around the folder she still clutched. Marcus shot up from his chair, anger breaking through his mask. "This is fabricated." Jonathan didn't flinch. "Then perhaps you'll enjoy the next exhibit." The recording began to play. Diana's voice filled the room, sharp and unmistakable. "Jonathan is a sentimental fool. Tomorrow he'll sign everything and lose it all." Marcus's voice followed, dripping with cruelty. 15 years pretending to be his friend, and it'll be worth it when I see his face." The silence after the recording was deafening. Diana's lips trembled, her facade cracking. Marcus's fists clenched, rage and panic battling across his features. He tried to recover, forcing out words through gritted teeth. "That recording means nothing, a child's trick. No one will take it seriously." At that moment, the door opened again. Small footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Jasmine walked in, her tiny frame dwarfed by the vastness of the room. A social worker stood at the door, silent witness. Jasmine stepped up to the table, her eyes fierce. Her voice steady though soft. "Hello, Mr. Marcus, remember me? I was under your desk when you called Mr. Yamamoto and said you'd steal Mr. Jonathan's company." The color drained from Marcus's face. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Diana tried desperately to seize control. "You can't trust a child. She's nothing." Gabriel pressed play again on his phone, this time revealing Diana's own words laced with venom, mocking Jonathan as a little dog, laughing at how easily he would fall. Her voice echoed through the room like a confession carved into stone. The investigators exchanged glances, then stepped forward. "Marcus Williams." "Diana Foster, you are under arrest for embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Marcus shouted, spittle flying, "You set us up, Jonathan." Jonathan straightened his tie, his voice calm, unshakable. "No, you dug your own grave. I just handed you the shovels." Marcus struggled against the officers, his charm finally gone, his mask shattered. Diana collapsed into her chair, her eyes wet, a carefully crafted world crumbling. Jonathan turned, his gaze lingering on Jasmine, the unlikely ally who had given him not just warning, but the time to prepare. In their arrogance, Marcus and Diana had believed they controlled every move. Instead, their desperate attempt to frame him had become the very evidence that sealed their fate. The gamble they thought was theirs to win had turned into their final mistake. The sound of metal clicking shut echoed through the conference room as the officers tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. His face burned red with fury, veins bulging against the mask of charm he had worn for 15 years. Diana's shoulders collapsed under the weight of her own silence, her carefully sculpted confidence dissolving into pale resignation. Through the tall windows, the late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the polished floor, stretching their shadows long and thin, like remnants of power slipping away. Jonathan stood still, watching without moving, without speaking, as the two people he had once trusted more than anyone were escorted out past him. The moment felt unreal. For years, he had shared meals with them, celebrated victories, toasted milestones. Now every laugh, every handshake, every word of loyalty was revealed as a lie. Yet instead of rage, a strange calm filled him, a quiet unlike any he had known in months. Jasmine tugged at his sleeve, her small eyes wide as she looked up at him. "Are you sad, Mr. Jonathan?" she asked, her voice carrying only innocent curiosity. He glanced down at her, the corner of his mouth curving slightly, and shook his head. "No, Jasmine. For the first time in years, I feel lighter, like I can finally breathe again." Her smile flickered, and she leaned against him, satisfied with his answer. The officers led Marcus and Diana through the glass doors, their protests muffled, their futures sealed. Outside, reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing, microphones ready to devour the scandal. The company's name would make headlines, but this time not because of innovation or success, but because betrayal had been dragged into the light. Jonathan turned away from the chaos, focusing instead on the child at his side. She had no title, no wealth, no power. Yet she had saved everything. His phone buzzed on the table, a new email notification. He picked it up, scanning the message quickly. The Japanese investors had canceled the deal. They wanted no part in a company touched by scandal, no matter the truth. For a second, disappointment tried to settle in his chest, but it didn't last. Because almost immediately after, another message came through, then another. 3 different corporations, each one larger and more respected than the last, reaching out with interest in partnerships built not on deceit, but on integrity. Jonathan read the words carefully, a slow realization dawning on him. Marcus and Diana had believed removing him would destroy the company, that without their manipulation it would collapse. Instead, their downfall had unlocked doors Jonathan never thought possible. By exposing them, the rot had been cut out, and now the foundation could finally grow stronger. He set the phone down, meeting Jasmine's gaze. "Do you know what this means?" he asked softly. She tilted her head. "That you won." He smiled, shaking his head gently. "No. It means the fight was worth it. Because now the right people want to build with us, not use us." Jasmine nodded, though her young mind could only grasp part of what he meant. Still, her eyes shone with pride. She had been the spark that lit the fire, and somehow she knew it. Jonathan looked back out the window. The sun dipped lower, its light catching the glass towers of the city, painting them in shades of orange and gold. It no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a beginning. Behind him, the sound of footsteps faded as the last of the officers left with Marcus and Diana. The room was empty now, stripped of their voices, their lies, their shadows. Only Jonathan and Jasmine remained, standing in the quiet after the storm. And in that silence, Jonathan understood something profound. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't always triumphant. Sometimes it was simply the peace of knowing that truth had spoken louder than deceit. He placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Steady, certain. Come on," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We've got work to do." The company wasn't just alive. It was free. And for Jonathan Miller, that freedom was more valuable than any contract ever signed. 6 months later, the world looked different. Jonathan's new office overlooked the city from the 20th floor, larger and brighter than the one where betrayal had almost destroyed him. The skyline stretched endlessly, but for once he wasn't looking at numbers or contracts. His eyes lingered on a small picture frame on his desk. It showed Jasmine in a school uniform, her smile unguarded, her eyes full of light instead of fear. She had gone from sleeping in shelters to attending one of the best private schools in the city. For the first time in her young life, she was safe. Gabriel knocked and entered, carrying a file. He placed it on the desk with an expression halfway between astonishment and relief. "I found something, Jonathan. Something you need to see." Jonathan opened the folder and his breath caught. Birth certificates, old family records, faded photographs. The name leapt out at him like destiny whispering through paper. Josephine Miller, Jasmine's grandmother, his cousin, lost to the family more than 30 years ago. The truth sank in like a revelation, both bitter and sweet. All this time, Jasmine wasn't just the child who had saved his company. She was blood, his blood. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if searching for the hand of fate. He thought of that night in the parking lot, the command that had stopped him in his tracks. "Shut up," he had thought it was coincidence. But now he understood it was something more. It was family calling to family in the most unlikely way. When he told Jasmine, her eyes filled with tears, she tried to blink away. "Does that mean you're really my family?" she whispered, voice trembling. Jonathan knelt to meet her gaze, his own eyes stinging. "It means you always were. It just took us this long to find each other." She threw her arms around him with the fierce grip of a child who had learned too young how to let go. From that day forward, Jonathan never let her drift again. 3 months later, the adoption was finalized. In the same courthouse where Marcus and Diana had been sentenced, Jasmine Miller became official. She wore a simple blue dress, her hand clutching Jonathan's as the judge signed the papers. The irony was not lost on him. In the place where betrayal had been exposed, a family was born. 5 years passed. Miller Industries had grown stronger than ever, not only surviving but flourishing under Jonathan's renewed leadership. But the true legacy was not in profits. It was in the Jasmine Foundation, a scholarship and housing program for street children that Jonathan and his daughter had created together. On the night of its anniversary, the ballroom glittered with warm light. More than 200 children had been lifted out of despair by the foundation, each one a living reminder that hope could rise from ruin. At the center of the stage stood Jasmine, no longer the frightened girl from the back seat of a car, but a confident 12-year-old. Dressed in white, speaking to the audience with clarity beyond her years. "I was once invisible," she said into the microphone, "but someone chose to see me. Now it's my turn to see others." The applause thundered, but Jonathan barely heard it. He was too busy watching her, his heart swelling with pride. Gabriel leaned over, murmuring with a smile, "It's still unbelievable. A child saved a $200 million company." Jonathan shook his head softly, eyes never leaving Jasmine. "No, Gabriel, she saved more than that. She saved me." Later, when the dinner quieted and the room dimmed, Jasmine slipped her hand into his and asked the question only she could. "Do you think Grandma knew this would happen?" Jonathan thought for a long moment, remembering Josephine, remembering how Jasmine had appeared just when he needed her most. He answered quietly, I think she knew more than we realized, and I think she would be proud to see what you've done. Jasmine smiled, leaning her head against his arm, content. Across the ballroom, a banner read the Jasmine Foundation, building futures from second chances, and Jonathan understood the final truth. Marcus and Diana's betrayal had tried to strip him of everything. Instead, it had given him the one thing money could never buy, a daughter, a family, a purpose. Sometimes betrayal doesn't end your story. Sometimes it writes the chapter you were always meant to live. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.